Welcome to this video on React, Redux and TypeScript. In this video we're going to implement the Redux library in our React application using TypeScript. And this leads us to why we even use Redux. And if you've followed along with the introductory React tutorial, we've already seen that parsing state across multiple components can be quite messy, even in simple cases. And we need a clean way to manage our state. So this is more important as the application grows in size, and Redux provides a nice architecture to our application to manage the state efficiently and effectively in a clean manner. And it offers predictable state management using the three core principles, and that is there's a single source of truth. And all that means is we wrap our application to have one single state, which is the state of the entire application, and that's just done in a JavaScript object, and that explains the state of the application. There is also the second principle that state is read-only, and this encourages immutability. So rather than changing the object itself or changing the state itself, this is sort of done in another way, but we don't directly change the state. We create a new state and we return it. And the changes are done using pure functions, and that goes into our what's known as a reducer. And a pure function is just a consistent output for an input. So if you had a sum function that adds two numbers, a and b, together, it's always going to return the response a plus b. It's not going to give us any surprises back where it returns a string or anything like that. It's just a consistent output for whatever the input is. And this pure function allows for the predictable state management to be implemented across our entire application. So just a little bit of terminology. There's 4 key steps in our Redux application, and that is there's an action which goes into a reducer, and the reducer processes the action, and then the state is stored in the store, and the state is propagated across all of the user interface components that make use of that state. So as an example here, if you click a button, it goes through a reducer, which is the pure function, and that creates an output. So the state or the store, and React notices state change and makes the changes to the UI. So you click a button, it gets processed through a pure function or a reducer. This gives consistent output, which creates the output that we need in the store, and the state or the store, which are used interchangeably, React can notice this. It notices the changes in the DOM and it propagates that throughout our application, so everything's updated seamlessly in our user interface. And it was inspired by the Flux pattern, which is a software architecture which is quite similar in the fact that you have an action, a dispatcher, so you dispatch the action, it makes its way to the store, and then it updates the view. So let's go ahead and create our application here, and I'll just open up the terminal with a control tilde, and I'm going to copy this command in here, and I'm just going to call it my app. It doesn't really matter. So we've got npx create React app, my app, and then the extra additional flag here is -- template TypeScript for the TypeScript by default. So we'll wait for that to load, but while that's loading, we can actually start to already look at the project architecture for what we're going to build here. So I'll reduce the size of this terminal so we can see it. So within our source folder in our React project, what we're going to do is, like always, we have our index file and our app file, and these will be TSX files now, likewise with our components that we create. And this is where we can sort of start to wrap our store around our application. And we need to provide that store or the state to our entire application, and we can do that by wrapping our application in the index file. And we can also go ahead and we can create a home page, so our app components lean, and the only UI that it renders is the home page itself, and that way we can have our state and our props mapped accordingly and connecting to the store with that sort of logic through the app. So we can, in our home page, this is where we can actually go ahead and display our counter buttons, and of course we're going to have a store, and we're going to have a root store which configures all of the reducers together, and there will also be a models for the entire application. So that means there's going to be a TypeScript interface for the application state, and each particular entity that we're working with is going to have a separate folder. And this is the way I sort of like to architect the applications, our React Redux applications is, okay, so we're familiar with this part, the index app and components from regular React, but we've introduced this store folder, and this store folder configures our Redux store, so we have state in our application. We're going to wrap our entire app with the store, so it has access to the data, but each individual entity that we're dealing with, such as counter, is going to have its own section. So just for clarity here, what we're going to build is we're just going to build a Redux store, so we can click a button to make a counter, and we can add or subtract from the counter, and we render that. And we're actually, I've chosen this architecture here because you can expand upon it, and the whole point of using Redux is to have a sophisticated but clean way to manage your state. So it takes a little bit of effort to set up in the first place, but once you've set up the architecture, you can reuse it and reuse the same sort of format. So as your application grows, you've got a clean way to manage your state. So in our example, we're going to have a counter, but then we might extend that, and we can use this same sort of folder structure here, and then we might have an extra one in the next video where we deal with asynchronous operations, like getting data from a database or an API call or something like that. But this will make a lot more sense once we actually just get into it. But just to explain the folder structure for the particular entity that we're dealing with, it's going to have its own action and its reducer. So something that we call, which is just a function. So you click a button and we might trigger this action, say, oh, okay, can you add something for us? Or can you minus something for us? That gets processed through our reducer, which updates the state in our store. And of course, we're going to have some interfaces because we're using TypeScript, so we can have type safety for that. And then once we get more than one region that we're dealing with, we can actually extend this, and then that's why we have this models and actions, because this actions right now refers to counter, but as we extend it, we need the applications actions to be type safe as well. So enough talking, let's just get into it. And we can start just by cding into my app, and let's just take a look at the default TypeScript files here. So we're not going to need this file at all. We'll just delete this app.css, remove that. Okay, and I'm going to remove logo and app CSS from our application. I'm also going to remove everything within this div here, And I'm going to remove the class name as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and save that. We can delete this test file here. Oh, we might just keep this just to have the font. But we can delete this logo here. And we can delete setup test. We won't be doing any testing at all. And we can, oh, we'll just leave this here for now. Okay, so referring back to our project structure, we're going to be working in the index file, the app file to start off with. So, and we're also going to start by just creating some components without any state at the moment. So let's just go ahead and create that. So in this source folder here, I'll just do a new folder and I'm going to call it components. And within this, I'm going to create a homepage.tsx file. And I'm also going to create a counter button.tsx. So I'm just going to order these in a hierarchy sort of way. So in our index file here, we're going to need to wrap this entire application with the store. But first we need to create the store. So if we look in our app file, which is next in the hierarchy, what we want to do is, rather than return an empty div, we want to return our home page. And we need to, of course, create our home page before we can import it. So in the home page, I am going to just do a class-based component. So I can just type in React class-based component here and click tab, because I got the React extension in VS Code. So our home page, this is where we're going to have our UI sort of logic. So not logic, but just our user interface basically, and our props. So we next need to go into our counter button file, and I might make this a functional based component, and I'm just going to type this out by hand because I do want to make some modifications to this component. Oops, don't need that yet. So we'll just import React from React, so we have access to that. And I'm going to call this button with a capital B. It will take some props, so I might just say props here. And I'm going to need to give this a type because we're using TypeScript. But before that, I might just get the shape going. And what we're going to do here is we're going to return, and what we'll do is we'll actually just make our button, and we'll just make it on a span element. Doesn't really matter. We can have this span element here like this, and in our span it's going to, okay, so there's going to be two buttons. There's going to be a increment button and a decrement button. So what we can do here is we can actually do something like this. So we can get the props.children. So when we call the button from our home page here, so if I had a button here like this, it's going to be a closing component. So that means if I put something in here like this, like increment, these children props contained within this button will be accessible to our span, or what's in our span for our button. So we can dynamically change that. And to do that, I'm just going to do a little bit of destructuring here. So I'm going to say const, and I'm going to have actually we don't need that for destructuring purposes. From within this component, oh actually sorry, what I might do is I might actually write our interface out first. So I'll create an interface for our button props, and I'm going to want a color because that's another prop we want to pass in, and it's going to be a string. So that means for our button, for the props that we're passing in, we can actually use this props with children, and that takes a type of button props. So we get that from React. And now that we have defined our type here with this property here alongside with the children props, what we can do is we can use destructuring here to get the color and also to get the children, and that's going to be from the props. So in addition to the children prop, we can also have the color from the home page that we're calling the button with, and we can just use JSX syntax or TSX syntax if you like. And I'm going to make this increment button light green. So of course we need to import the button. So let's import that, and the file path for that is in the same directory, counter button. Now we need to export it. So what we can do is in counter buttons we can just say, okay, export default button, so we don't have to use the curly braces because it's only going to be the one single component or the button that we're exporting, so we use default. And we're destructuring the color that gets passed in as a prop in addition to the children. And we're using this props with children type, which takes the props that aren't the children as a type in itself. So now that we have access to the color and the children, we can go ahead and give our span some shape. So what I might just do here is I might just use the style tag and use JSX so we can return a object of styles. And I'm just going to give it a pointer class. A background color is going to be equal to the color that was input into it. And we could do some TypeScript to enforce certain colors, but I'm not going to go into that much detail about TypeScript types. If you want more information, I actually got a video on TypeScript types. And we'll make the margin 20 pixels, and I'll make the padding 10 pixels. And of course we're going to want to click something and handle that click. And I don't need to use this props here anymore because I've destructured it from the props. So let's just go ahead and save that. Save that. And we'll need to import our home page into our app. From the components folder, from the home page file. So now with that, we can, and I might actually just change this to a class-based component here. So the class app extends component, which means we need to auto import that from React. So we get the syntax there destructured for us. And within that, we need to return it within our render function. And what this is returning for us is actually of the type JSX.element, because we're returning this home page here, and this needs a closing tag. So if I save this and I run an npm start, let's see what we get. Okay, great. We got the button increment here, and it's got the cursor and the colors. Of course, it's not going to do anything just yet, but we've got the beginning of our application ready to go, our main component that we need. So what we can do is we can go to our app file. Actually, we'll go into our homepage file, because what we want to do is we want to align this in the center and give it a little bit of spacing so it's just a little bit more readable. So in our homepage file, let's just add some classes here. So within this div, we're going to have, and we're also going to have two buttons here. So I might make an orange button as well for decrement. And within this div containing those buttons, we can have a style here, and we can set the text align to center, margin top of 40 pixels, and a font size of 2 rem, which should be 32 pixels by default. It's 16 for 1 rem. And we also want to render in a span what the number is. So we'll just hard code a 0 here for now. And let's just save that to see what we got. And okay, so we've got an increment button, a decrement button, and we want to set up our Redux in a sophisticated way so we can continue to grow it, but also address this state issue that we've been having. So let's do that. And to do that, we're going to need to look at our file structure here. And the first thing you'll notice is we're going to need a store to contain our state in. So in the source folder, I'm going to create a folder called store. And within store, the core file is the root store. So I'll create a root store. And of course that needs to be .ts. It doesn't need to be tsx because it's not a component, it's just the configuration of the store. So let's do that. And okay, this is where we can actually start to create our store. So let's import create store, combine reducers from Redux. Let's import we're going to need to import our reducer, so we'll do that. but we'll need to create the reducer first. So what we want to do is we want to actually export this what's known as a root reducer, and that's going to contain all of our reducers. And right now we haven't created our reducer, but we're going to create a counter folder, and that's going to have a counter reducer within it. But we want to, when we expand this and create another section, we want to be able to encapsulate all of the reducers. So we have what's known as a root reducer, and we can use the combine reducers from Redux, and that just takes in an object, and this will just take in whatever the reducer that we have. So I need to create that, so that's also to do. And we need to have a application state of our entire application, which is based off all these reducers. So a reducer contains the state of, so for example, the counter reducer is going to have the state of the counter, but we'll also have some others, and we need to have access to that type globally. So we need to export a type here, and we can call this the application state, which is going to have a return type, which is the type of all of the reducers. So we can say the type of the root reducer. And finally we can create our store, so we have access to state within our application. So we create this store by using create store with the root reducer. So we do need to, before we can wrap our application and give it state, we do actually need to have a reducer and create a actions and reducer for count. So we can, if we look at our folder structure here, now there are going to be, and I'll create this now, so there's going to be a folder within store, a file within a folder called models, and there will be a file called actions.ts, but this is going to be to do also, because this is going to be combining all of our actions from all of our separate stores. So for example, we're going to create this counter store, and that's going to have the counter action and a counter reducer, and then if we create another one, we're going to have actions and reducers for those, and then when we write those out, we can combine all of those, and then that's going to be given in the actions.ts here. So I can just close that for now. But what we can do, now we have our models within our store, is we can create we've created actions.ts. We can create our particular store within that store that we're using. So we are going to create a folder, and we're going to call this counter, and counter is going to contain our counter action.ts, and it's also going to contain our counter reducer. So I'm going to put these over here. But in addition to those, we're going to have some TypeScript on those, so we can have some models to model the actions and the type that we're dealing with for the counter itself. So within counter, we can have a folder called models. We create this new file called actions.ts, and finally we have a folder called, or a file called counter.ts with a capital C. So let's actually just start with this counter. That's going to be the easiest thing to do, and we can just export a interface here for counter, and it's going to have a count of number. And I've chosen an interface because for most applications you're going to have some sort of data structure to be enforced of an object which has more variables than just one. So for example, this counter, it could also have an associated time of last click with it or something like that. But for these purposes, to showcase Redux, we'll just keep it simple like that. So that's the counter here. We can pretty much just close that now. But within the models for our counter, this is where we can actually start to have some of our action types. And we need to export these types. And we're going to have two types here. We're going to have an increment counter, which is just going to be the same thing in a string, and we are going to shift alt down this, and we are going to change increment counter to decrement counter. So notice the capital letters here. This is to signify that this is an action to be dispatched, and we keep it in this variable because we want to reference it in other files, and it just clearly shows what the type is. So whenever you look in a Redux file structure or folder structure and application, you see this, you can clearly identify that this is an action type. So we need an interface for this action type for each one of them, and the increment action is just going to have a type, which is going to be the type of increment counter. And we specify in this variable because rather than just typing in string here, one, because it's so you don't make any spelling mistakes like accidentally put an R or something like that, and then so we can reference that in the reducers or other files as well. So we can copy this interface for increment action, and we can have decrement action, which is going to be of the type of decrement action. And we're going to need access to all of these action types in our models or our actions for our global actions. So we can go ahead and export this type here, and this is going to be called counter action types. So note the interface is what we're doing, so we're incrementing tacked on with this action keyword, and this one has the global word of the global state that we're dealing with, so counter, and then followed by action types. And the action types are simply just going to be the combination of the two interfaces here. Because we're going to need these types, we're going to need to return either an increment or process an increment action or a decrement action, which is of the counter action types in our reducer. So now that we have our actions model for our counter setup, we can actually begin to write our actions itself. So what we can do here is we can import, and we can go ahead and import those actions. So I'll push this over here, just here. So I can import the increment counter, the decrement counter from models/actions. So we just define those. And so we define the shape of the actions and the name of them. So there's increment counter and decrement counter. So now we need to provide the functionality, or not the this is the action to trigger that functionality, which we'll set up shortly. But we can export this because we're going to need to call these elsewhere in our application. So I'm just going to do this export constant increment count function here, and rather than, because we're going to return a object, I can use this sort of shorthand syntax to wrap it in these parentheses. So I can just go ahead and return something of the type increment counter, and I can duplicate this and I can just call this decrement counter, and I can call this decrement counter. And this is going to make a lot more sense when I write the reducer. It's all going to come together. So in the counter reducer, I need to import these action types. I need to import the increment counter and the decrement counter as well. So I can copy this here like that. And these are going to come from the models and the actions within the models. I then need to import the counter model itself. From models counter, and what we can do here is this is where we're going to create our reducer, but our reducer is essentially looking out for some sort of action. So it's going to look out for this increment counter action that's been dispatched by clicking a button or something like that. It dispatches this increment counter action, or might dispatch this decrement counter action. So what our reducer does is it handles these actions. So we can, and we're going to need this elsewhere, so we need to export this counter reducer, and this is of the type reducer, and this takes in the counter type and the action, and as parameters it's going to have a state, and it's going to have an action, and this is going to give us in the result some sort of state that we're expecting back. So I'm just going to lay this out first, and then I'm going to do all the imports just to sort of understand how this reducer is a pure function and how it deals with the action types. And it's essentially just a switch statement. All it is it takes in the action type, so the decrement counter or increment counter, and based on that action type, so these are the actions, and each of the actions, they have a type here. They could also have something like a payload. So let's say you have some sort of adding function and you have to pass in the variable of the number you're going to add, and then it returns another number, but because it needs an input, it needs the payload, and then you could have a payload which is like the object of data or something like that associated with it. And it's traditional to do payload, although you can import the arguments one by one as well. But we'll see that later on when we come to the asynchronous part. But what we're doing is from those increment counter or decrement counter actions, those actions that we're taking in here, they're going to have a certain type. They're always going to have a type, and that's how we identify how to handle the action. And we handle that action in different ways. So if we have the case that the action is the increment counter, well, we need to return something. So we need to return something. And if it's the case that it's the decrement counter, we need to return something. And if it doesn't match any of these, we just need to return back whatever the original state was, because nothing's happened. So return state, and we get that as an argument here. But we need to have a default state, so it has something to fall back on. Because right now we have our counter model, which is a number, but there's no number associated with it. So we need to have a constant default state, which is going to be of the type counter, which is the count variable, and we're going to have it by default set to 0. And this is an object. So, and of course we need to import reducer from React. Actually, it's not from React. It should be from Redux. Let's see. And we're going to need an action as well. Okay, so because we're using TypeScript, we're going to need to get some certain types from React and Redux. So we're going to need to install some type packages here. So if we look into our package file, we do have some of these types here, but we are going to need a couple of additional types. And these are going to be dev dependencies. So let's go ahead and just install those. So I can do npm install -d, because TypeScript's just for development. It's not going to be there after compilation. But we will need some types. So we need React-Redux. And we're going to need types actually, we'll just get that in for now. So now as a dev dependency, we got types React-Redux. So now it recognizes this reducer and action from Redux. So we can continue creating our reducer. So yeah, our reducer just takes the action that gets dispatched. It recognizes which action type it is, and depending on that case, it handles the action type and returns a certain state. We can import a default state. So when our application starts off, it's going to have this default state here, and this is expecting something to be returned of the based on our application state. So recall that the principles from Redux instate that we have a predictable state management, and in particular the changes are done using pure functions, which encourages immutability. So we're not directly changing the state or object, we're creating a new state. So we don't modify the state directly. I can close this package.json, which means rather than making some sort of change on whatever the current state is, and by default that's going to be equal to the default state, and the action is going to be defined as the counter action types we have created here. So we can save that. We can create a new state. So let's say the next state, and we can do this by getting whatever the state is. So you could destructure the state, or in this case just get the count and get the state of the count. So this is a new variable here. So what we can do when we increment the counter is, okay, we can say the next state dot count is equal to the state dot count plus 1. So whatever the state count is, so it's 0 by default. If it's not already set, it will be set to 0. If you click this button that says increment counter, dispatches that action, and then it takes a copy of the state or destructures that, so there's no direct reference to that variable anymore. So we have a clean separation of our pure function here, and we can simply just return the next state. So that's how we bypass not changing the original state. And we can pretty much just copy this for our decrement counter case and then just -1 from here. Okay, great. So we've got our reducer now. Now what we can do, that we have our actions and our reducers, and we can actually just come back to this root store now, and we can actually create our store. So we need to import the reducer. So we can import the counter reducer, we called it. Yep. From the counter folder and the counter reducer file. So we need that reducer because that contains the counter state. So we need to, in our root reducer, combine all of our reducers, and we need to have the counter reducer. So now we have everything we need to create our store. We have the application state, which is the counter reducer state, and we can create the store. Okay, so we're doing really good. So now, one more thing before we create this store is we need to set up our global actions. So in our models folder, in our actions file here, in our upper level, we need to import, and we had some sort of counter action types here. So we need all of the action types in our entire app here. That's going to come from counter, models, actions. And we need to export this type. So we have the entire app actions type. And right now, this is just going to be the counter action types. When we extend this, there's going to be an all and whatever this is called here. So we can have all of our action types there just like that. So we've got our actions, we've got our reducers, we've got everything defined, we've got our root store, got our buttons, and I might just start to close some of these files over this side. So if we come back to our index.tsx file here, this is where we can actually start to create our store. So we can go ahead and import store, and this is going to come from store/root store. And how does our application get access to this store and propagate the changes across the DOM with React seamlessly? Well, we simply need to wrap our application and give it that state. So we have our store, we also need our provider here. So we can import provider, and provider just comes from us from React Redux. So this is just a component in which we can wrap our entire application with. So provider, and the reason it's showing this error here is because it requires a store to be passed in as a prop. Okay, cool. We've got our store here. We no longer need to be concerned with this index file. Now we can take a look at the app file. And this is where we are going to sort of set up our store, if you will. So the store's been set up, but one thing that hasn't been mentioned yet is that we're going to have certain state and properties in different components, and they're going to be passed through each other through props. And we're also going to have some actions, and they're going to be passed through props as well. So just to clarify here, we're going to need to connect our app to the store. So in the index file, we've wrapped our app element so it has access to the store, but this app component needs to be able to connect to that store. And without React, there's a way to do that, and that's just you subscribe to the store and you wait for changes to come back. But in React, we need to connect to it in another way, and to connect to it, there's actually a function from React Redux called connect, and that just allows us to propagate those changes throughout our DOM hierarchy seamlessly. We'll also need to dispatch some actions here. So there's going to be a particular type called dispatch, and that's going to come from Redux. We've got our home page here. So we also need our store. So we need to import, well, we need the application state of the store. So we're going to have a particular type for that, and that's what we define in the root store. And in addition to that, we're going to pass in as props certain functions. So we're going to have a function to increment the count. Well, it's going to be an action to dispatch. So we got our action to increment the count and decrement the count, and then we've got the reducer to handle that. But to dispatch it, we need to dispatch that through some props. But we're going to need access to those. So let's go ahead and import those. Increment count, decrement count. They're coming from the store. from the counter folder and counter action. Okay, so how does our app connect to our store? Well, there's this connect function here, and this is a higher order function that returns a function because we're doing some special things where we're essentially looking through our entire application, detecting changes and propagating those through the multiple places. We need this higher order function to be able to do that, and this takes in two properties or functions here, and it's going to take map state to props and map dispatch to props, and we'll explain both of these, and then it's going to export the application for us. So everything in our app here that's contained within our store, but we need to create these functions here. So I'm just going to copy these up here, and before I even write those, actually right here we need to actually have an interface for our app props. So what we want to do is we want to pass in some props that are going to be received in our counter button, and namely, because we're in the application, they need to go through the home page. The ability to increment and decrement the function, and then that needs to go into the counter buttons. So I'm going to start off by defining it from the parent to the child, and we'll follow along, and then we can look at it in the reverse order, and hopefully that makes sense. So I'm going to create this app props here, and there's going to be an increment function, and this isn't going to return anything, and there's going to be a decrement function, and this is also going to return void. So this is just the shape of it, it's not the actual function itself, and we need to create that variable map state to props, and I might just copy it in here. And this is going to take the state, and it's going to take the entire app state, so everything in our application which is defined by the reducers, and we can use this shorthand to return an object. So because we have access to the app state from our root store, which is all the reducers, and essentially we just got count with the count property, but you can see how this architecture is expandable to encapsulate the entire state of the application. Right now what this is doing for us is it's just going to have the count, and this is based on the state that's passed in, and we have access to the counter reducer on that state, and within that we have access to the count. So essentially what we're doing is we have access to this app state, or the shape of the app state, when we defined it in our store, which is the combination of the reducers and everything within those reducers. So we can actually pass in that state from there, and we can access what we expect back, which is entire application essentially. So we can map that state as props, and the reason we're mapping it as props is because we don't want to display the count here, we want to display it within a nested child component, i.e. the counter button. But we've got to go through this home page as well. So the second function that we need to return here is map dispatch to props. And once again, this is going to be a arrow function. And like the name suggests, it takes dispatch, and that's why we've imported dispatch in here from Redux. And this is actually going to return something for us. And what it's going to return for us here is it's going to have the app props type come back, and the app props type, as we defined here, is this increment and decrement function. So I'm going to copy the model shape of that. Now this is where we can actually dispatch our actions. So I'm just going to type in here increment count, and then I can just change this to decrement count, and these don't need that, but that needs that. So we've got the increment count and the decrement count actions, so we define those actions in the appropriate counter section for those actions. So we're able to handle those actions through our reducers, and we have access to the state of that through providing the state of the global application in the store and wrap that in our application. All we really need to do is trigger that action to occur. And we create we connect to the store here in our application, and that gets passed in as props to everything else in our application, which is nested within home. But we need to set up the core logic relating to that connection outside of the app. So when we have this map dispatch to props, we have this dispatch action essentially, which is a function itself, which triggers a function. So it's a little bit confusing in that sense, but it's quite straightforward in the sense that you're just calling a function. So just imagine you click a plus button and it adds a button, it fires an action and it dispatches that action, and it calls this increment count action, and as we know that has a certain type, and then our reducer looks at that type and it reduces it down, so it returns through a pure function the state of the next state, and that's going to have all of the props, and that props for count is accessible throughout our application because we connect to it and made that map state to props. So this is doing a similar thing here for map dispatch to props, where we're passing in the actions, and whenever we call one of those actions, it's getting passed through as a prop. So that means we're able to call these functions and have access to this count through the props. So that means our component is going to have of the type the app props and the app state, where the app state is defined from the reducer and the app props is defined here. So the app props are those increment and decrement functions, or the actions to dispatch, and then of course the app state is the app state, which is just simply count. So with that, we're able to return a JSX element, which is just this home page element, but we want to pass into this home page all of the props related to this app class. And we can use some destructuring here, and we can actually just say ... this .props, and that's all we really have to do in our application here. So if we look into homepage, what we can do is, firstly, we can just create an interface here for props, and this is the props relative to the home page, not globally, although it is the combination of both the state and the app props. So actually we can just copy this sort of syntax here, and count is just going to be a number. So when we render this function here, now we have access to the count, the increment, and the decrement. And the reason I've created this interface here is because you'll see that it's not aware of what type of props it's actually getting in. So we know that it can receive the count, increment, and decrement props, so we can destructure those from this dot props by saying equals. But if I was to say core count, we still get this error here because it doesn't exist on a type read only. So I can just go ahead and use this TypeScript syntax to ensure that these destructured props are in relation to these interface props, which is, you know, the state and the props. So now we have access to those, we can just use JSX to sort of provide that data to our button components and even this component itself. So, okay, so what we might do here is, rather than hard code this 0 here, we can hard code, we can dynamically render the count. Recall that that's 0 by default. And this button, in addition to having the ability to show the children, so the increment or decrement, and receive a color, we also want it to have this handle click prop passed in. So this is what we're passing into button. So we're defining that prop as handle click, but we want to pass in our function here, increment. And this is how we're going to connect from the button itself through the home page to the app and the global state. And we can see the Redux TypeScript application coming together. So we can also have this prop here, and of course it's yelling at me because I haven't defined that prop in the class. But essentially that's all we really need in this component here. So if we take a look at the counter button, we can go ahead and we can take in, we're taking in the props, and those props have children. So in addition to that color prop, we're now going to have this handle click prop, which is defined as a function here, and that's going to just return nothing. So in addition to this styling of the button, you need to use that button in two different ways to modify this state. So I can actually save this here. So if I modify the state in two different ways, I need to pass in that as a prop, and the handle click can change on click. So just on this span here, I'm going to have this on click, and I'm going to use JSX to make that the handle click. which means I also need to destructure it from the props and save it. So now we have pretty much everything we need here to run our application. So let's just run an npm start and let's just see what we've done here. So that error is because I forgot to install React Redux and Redux. So what we can do here is we can just go npm install Redux, and we also need the React-Redux. And that's probably something we should have done at the beginning of the video, but never mind. So now if I run an npm start, we should have our dependencies we require. And if we open up localhost 3000 with npm start, what I can do, I can increment the value and I can decrement the value as well, and it's keeping our global state all nice. So there's just one more thing I would like to discuss before finishing off this particular video on React Redux TypeScript, and that is if we come have a look at our architecture, the Redux, the Redux flux pattern in action. To summarize, we click a button and then that fires an action, it dispatches an action, and that action gets handled in a reducer, which is just a pure function that handles the actions with a switch statement. It modifies the state or the store, which is accessible in our entire application. The changes are made to that store, and because we're connected to that store, all of our components, all of our actions that get dispatched, and all of our state gets mapped through as props into our components, so they have access to that globally. And one really nice thing is something that's known as middleware. So middleware, similar to if you've programmed in Node or anything, is a function that happens in between something. So what we want to happen is something to happen between action and reducer. And in particular, we want to use Redux Logger. So that's something we'll need to install. And okay, let's just install that. But how it works is it receives the action. In between the action and the reducer, there's this middleware function, and what it's going to do for us is going to really nicely log it out. So what we can do is we can just install that. So we can do an npm install Redux Logger, and there's going to be some associated types with that because we're using TypeScript. Lots of the packages that we use, they're going to have some associated types with it, so that's just something to keep in mind when using TypeScript. But we're going to have the types for the Redux Logger and the logger itself. So we'll just wait for those to install. And if we take a look back at our root store, where we create our store, we can import from Redux the apply middleware function, and the apply middleware function does just that. It applies the middleware, so we're going to need the particular middleware that we're using, and I'm going to import create logger, and this is really nice, from Redux -logger, and this is just for development purposes. It doesn't, when you build the project, it won't be there. So That's all good. But we need to create a particular instance of logger. So let's just create a logger using create logger. And this logger is going to be passed into our store, and we can pass a second parameter here called apply middleware, and this is where we can pass in our logger here. So we can go ahead and we can just save that, and with that, if we run an npm start, we should see our logger in action, so our middleware in action. So let's just open F12 in Google Chrome Developer Tools, the console. Our default state is 0. If we fire an action, the middleware intercepts that action and it looks at the state. So this is really great because it logs out exactly what's going on, and as your application grows you can see everything going on here. So it has the previous state, so when the button was 0, the counter reducer had a count of 0. It shows you the action that got called, so there's increment counter of type increment counter, and then it shows you the new state, so the next state where the count is 1. And of course this can happen each time that we fire off an action, and we can decrement it, and we see here we've got the decrement counter function. So similar to this middleware, there's also a middleware called Redux Thunk, and that's going to be used for asynchronous requests. So often in programming, in web development in particular, we're making requests to APIs, and because that's asynchronous, i.e. we need to wait for something, we need to have a particular middleware, so there's a delay between the action when you click something, wait for the response, and then the reducer handles that. Otherwise the reducer is firing before that happens and then nothing's going to happen. So we'll take a look at the Redux Thunk middleware in the next video. Thanks for watching.